It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right, we're back. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host this morning. And we're going to talk this half, the half of this segment in reference to the issue of polygraph prosecutions. Now, there is two cases out there where they are actively prosecuting people for teaching other people how to beat a polygraph test. And I got to tell you, most of the guys who do this are law enforcement or ex-law enforcement themselves. But and they're trained in, doing polygraph tests for law enforcement. And what they're saying is that there are ways to trick and beat a polygraph. You can control your breathing, you can control your muscle reactions, and so forth and so on. And one guy has actually already pled guilty, and it's the first prosecution of its kind in the country. Now, U.S. federal officials are investigating polygraph teachers who supposedly help job applicants fib their way through government lie detector tests. The criminal inquiry is seen as the Obama administration's latest attempt to preserve government secrecy. Here's the problem with this. First of all, polygraphs aren't even accepted in court. I mean, there is still a contention out there in the world that, despite what most people think, that polygraph is quack science in the sense that, there's so much of it that's subjective, i.e., based upon the guy who's actually administering the test, as to whether or not it has any real credible validity, and because there's no definitive proof other than the guy who's the administrator of the test says, yes, he's lying, or no, he's not lying, and we don't know what influences or biases him or anything else, that it cannot be accepted in a court. Now, they've gone in there and taken the business records that belong to two different people, and they've used these documents to identify roughly 5,000 people who sought advice on how to beat the tests. And out of that group of 5,000, 20 of the people that applied for government and federal contracting jobs were in that list of 5,000. And 10 of those 20 were actually hired by federal entities, including the NSA. So here's what the real meaning is behind what they're doing here. This doesn't have anything to do with anything other than this administration's determination to penalize whistleblowers and people who would actually come out and tell the truth about what's happening in America. The system is inadmissible throughout the U.S. court system. It can be used for employers to, test whether or not, you've been convicted of something that would make you a detrimental employee and what have you. But from a court's perspective, there's no legal substance or water to the polygraph test itself. And well, I'll just, there's a Supreme Court ruling on here, and I'll kind of read it to you. The machines were introduced in the earliest 20th century, gaining favor with police who observed a suspect's physiological response, blood pressure, pulse, and perspiration, when questioning someone about a crime. Multiple research studies held over the past 50 years have debated the polygraph's dependability, though with a 1998 Supreme Court ruling that declared, quote, there is simply no consensus that polygraph evidence is reliable. Consequently, because the polygraph itself is thought to be nonsense, experts say anyone who purports their ability to beat it themselves, or to teach people how to beat a polygraph, are themselves lying. So here's where you gotta realize the rubber hits the road. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because what they're doing is they're intruding on the First Amendment right of these individuals to speak, teach, write, whatever they want to say. And when you start with this group saying, well, it's because they're trying to teach people how to beat a federal polygraph, the next thing it'll be is they're saying, well, you can't teach people how to be gunsmiths when we've signed the AAT treaty, which Obama's, by the way, promising to sign this month. Or it'll be some other area where they say you can't write that book because by doing so, you're violating the law. You can't hold that speech because by that speech, you're teaching others how to do something we don't want done, and therefore you're in violation of the law. There is a Customs and Border Protection official. His name is Josh Schwartz. And he said, nothing like this has ever been done before. Most certainly, and here he's talking positively about this prosecution. Most certainly, our nation's security will be enhanced. There are a lot of bad people out there. This will help us remove some of these pests from society. Now, Doug Williams, he's a former polygrapher with the Oklahoma City Police, and he wrote a book on the subject. And they've already arrested him. There's another guy by the name of Chad Dixon from Indiana. He was the inspiration for the book itself. And the sources tell the news agency that prosecutors will attempt to sentence Dixon to 2 years in prison for wire fraud. And here's what they're charging him with: obstructing an agency proceeding. Now, first of all, that's a pretty vague statement. Obstructing an agency proceeding. First of all, what agency are we talking about? Secondarily, how can you prove that these guys intended to obstruct an agency proceeding? Apparently, they spent a ton of money sending undercover guys in to talk to these guys and saying, well, I'm going to apply for a federal government job and, I smoke pot, so how do I get past that? Or I've got a criminal thing in my background I don't want anybody to know about, so how can you help me to lie and beat the polygraph test so that I can get this job with the federal government or, whatever the case may be. If you're going to try and restrict that kind of information, then everything is open to defeat. Everything is open to government censorship. Here's a paragraph out of there. And there was a great article, by the way, in McClatchy about this, too. Critics assert that there is simply no crime in teaching methods to defeat the polygraph. Self-proclaimed experts freely advertise their services online, in books and on television, and have never before had to hide their services. This is not to mention the First Amendment legal battle over impeding free speech, which government prosecutors would surely face in court. Here's what McClatchy has to say. Gene Iredale, an attorney for one of the defendants. And he asked this question in the McClatchy article. If someone stabs a voodoo doll in the heart with a pin, and the victim they intended to kill drops dead of a heart attack, are they guilty of murder? Well, what if the person who dropped dead believed in voodoo? And that's essentially what we're talking about here. First, there's no assurance that these polygraph tests have any legitimacy at all. Then when we talk about the idea of whether or not someone can teach someone else how to defeat them, well, that's very, very subjective. One, the person who's teaching the person how to beat it has to really know something about the tests, and we don't even know that you can teach someone to control their breathing and their perspiration. How do you get somebody to control their perspiration? Really? These are the types of questions that are generally debated in a law school, not inside a courtroom, says Iredale. The real question should be, does the federal government want to use resources to pursue this kind of case? I would argue it does not. Dixon, who's 34 years old, is now about to go to prison. He's already been coerced and threatened into pleading guilty. He's refused to elaborate on his legal situation. You know why? Because he hasn't been sentenced yet, and he's afraid to speak out because the sentence will get a whole lot harsher if he does. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is coercion. That is force. That is government at work. He told McClatchy he began working as a polygrapher because he could not find work as an electrical engineer. He's the father of 4 children, and so far his home has gone into foreclosure, but he's never had any kind of criminal record, and he now expects that he's going to have to serve prison time. My wife and I are terrified, he said. I stumbled into this. I'm a Little League coach in Indiana. Never in my wildest dreams did I somehow imagine I was committing a crime. Now, our founders came out and said to us that law is not law if it is not understandable by the average Joe Six-Pack citizen in the United States. If people aren't aware of them, number one, then they're invalidated. This old argument that it's your responsibility to know the law cannot possibly be a legitimate or valid argument anymore, and I'll tell you why. It's real simple. We have attorneys' teams the size of professional football teams, and they can't keep up with it. How is one person who's got to go out and work for a living and then come home and walk the dog and do the dishes and and cut the grass? How is that person supposed to know what all of the ramifications are of every federal law out there? That's exactly the problem. There is no way that any one person can possibly understand what all of these federal laws are, and state laws on top of that. Don't forget, you got an obligation not only to follow the federal usurpation, but also your state. And that's why the old adage is out there that we're all felons by the time we've tied our shoes in the morning by at least 3 times. In other words, you've committed 3 felonies before you've actually had your breakfast. I don't know what they are, and it doesn't even matter. The point is that there are felonies out there that are so asinine and ridiculous that everyone is guilty of violating them every day. Here's another example. And when the law is so convoluted, when there are so many of them, and they overlap in so many ways, and they're so vague, and they're so completely indefinable, and the actual charge itself can be so vague that you can find almost anyone guilty of it, well then, we no longer have a republic. And I submit to you, that's exactly where we are. We now live in a police state where subjective whim of whomever is in charge of whatever department, they can find you and find a way to get to you and prosecute you and coerce you by force to accomplish their bidding. Whether that's whistleblowing, whether that is some function that you have in a job, whether that is to approach you as an attorney or a judge or a governor or a policymaker or a state representative or a state senator or a federal senator or a federal representative. You see, everybody is open to coercion now and compromise. And once you've been compromised, because all they got to do is say, well, look, you've run afoul of this, 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 and this, and this. And if you don't do what we tell you to do, we're going to prosecute you. We're going to spoil your name. Yes, you might even win in court. But when the news breaks that Senator so-and-so, State Senator so-and-so is under federal investigation, your political career is finished. When they say to an attorney, if you don't follow our lead here and do what we tell you to do, we're going to indicate that you are under investigation by the Department of Justice. And your career is destroyed. You'll never get another client again. And if you do, you're going to have to go from being a criminal trial lawyer to handling divorces and real estate deals, because that's all you're going to be good for. So, you either give this client up to us who we want, or we're going to ruin you. And then at the end of the day, because we've ruined you publicly, we're going to get him anyway. You see, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem. We now have a scenario where we operate exclusively under coercion and force. Government is force. It is nothing but force. It is force, one way or another. Even when you are the recipient of government's largesse, it comes because someone else has been forced to give something up so that they can redistribute it. That's true. Government doesn't have anything, doesn't produce anything, doesn't create anything. All it does is force some to do something so that others can benefit. And that beneficial experience comes with what? The strings that are tied to your enslavement. Because once you become dependent on government for anything, then for all intents and purposes, you no longer have free will. They are penalizing and persecuting and prosecuting these people because they want to shut this business down. They don't want people to know how to beat a polygraph. And I submit to you that it's not really the polygraph that matters here. You know, you may even have an argument to say, hey, I don't want people to learn how to beat a polygraph, especially if they're applying at the NSA. Maybe we don't want Islamist extremists to sneak into the country and apply. I'm not disagreeing with that. But I am saying to you that once you allow this activity, you open the door wide open for a broader and broader and broader mission creep. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are in the problem we're in it all today. You see, we keep opening the door, and it's only a notch. But then they force a wedge in and push the door wide open and raid the place like a stormtroopers. And they do this with issue after issue after issue after issue after issue after issue on ad infinitum. This is just one more area where doing something that is your right to do as a citizen, your ability to speak out and say, hey, you know, a lot of these tests are misused. I'm going to give you an example of how they are misused, and then I want you to understand why some people would want to necessarily beat these. Because you're saying to yourself, well, wait a second now, we can't have an Al-Qaeda representative applying to work over at the Justice Department. Well, let's understand something. Polygraph tests are used for not just applications to jobs for federal positions. They're also for jobs to private companies as well. In other words, many companies, make you take a polygraph to apply there. Now, they have the right to do that. I get that. You also have the right as an individual to know the best way that you can to pass that test. And I got to tell you, the number of false positives on polygraphs is so high that people who are completely legitimate and 100% innocent miss jobs, are turned down for opportunities because they failed a polygraph. Not because they were guilty of something, because they're nervous about taking a polygraph. It's an intimidating thing. So I submit to you that this is about far more than whether or not 10 people out of 20, out of 5,000 who talked to this guy actually got a job and shouldn't have. Again, it's the old adage. What do we do? For one example where something bad could happen, do we penalize the entire nation? You know, over and over and over and over and over, we have to keep addressing this question. And invariably, the answer always comes out to be the same. Hell no. You don't destroy the rights of one individual to make an argument that there's safety for the masses, when in fact it's not even true anyway. I mean, this is the same argument we got on the war on terror, the war on drugs. I mean, look, even Eric Holder, who I can't stand, has come out and said we need to revamp sentencing in the United States of America because these people who are, charged with federal crimes, in many cases they're low-level operatives. They catch a kid selling dope on the corner, and they charge him as a kingpin. And he gets 20, 30, 40 years for a bag of drugs that, is just, ridiculously small. And nonviolent crime. These are people who commit nonviolent crimes, and they get, years and years, decades in jail. I agree with the fact that this is all, the sentencing laws need revamping. And there should be no such thing as mandatory minimum sentencing. That's an absurdity. That says that the circumstances and the facts surrounding your case don't matter. And that's the whole, is not every case individual? Is every crime exactly the same? Is everyone guilty to the same level? Of course not. So when we talk about the war on terror, when we talk about the war on drugs, when we talk about the war on poverty, all of these things are designed to solve a problem of, for all intents and purposes, almost insignificant proportion. And yet, by this passage, literally vast numbers, far greater and far vaster than the people who are actually guilty of doing the wrong thing, are criminalized along with them. And here's a perfect example. Your rights get abrogated away from you. They get stolen from you, whether they're First Amendment, whether they're Second Amendment, it doesn't matter. Every time your rights are impacted negatively for the fear that someone else will do something, come on. Are we talking about, are you going to try and tell me that 10 out of the 20 applicants were eventually hired by various federal agencies, including the NSA? Are you trying to tell me that the only way you got to weed them out is with a polygraph test? Really? Then you guys are far bigger than Keystone Cops than I ever dreamt you were. That's the absurdity of this. But they lead you to believe that this is the only way to identify. This is the only way that we can identify that this guy applied to the NSA is really an Islamic terrorist from wherever, Mogadishu or some other place. Come on. If government is so incompetent that it hires 10 out of 20 out of 5,000 people, so what we're going to do is we're going to destroy the rights of every American to learn how to defeat a polygraph test because of that. Ladies and gentlemen, that's insane. You're listening to America's Voice Now. When we come back, we're going to be in our final segment, and I want to talk about this issue of what's going on with these SWAT raids that are all over the nation right now. We are seeing over and over and over again, example after example after example. When we come back, I'm going to talk about a Texas organic farm that had a 10-hour raid, full automatic weapons, because the grass was too tall and the bushes were growing too close to the street. Folks, that's a police state. We'll be right back.